Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am pleased to be here myself. My name is Peter Wyatt. I'm a retired United Church minister. At one point in my life, I was one of the general council secretaries of the United Church, faith, theology, and ecumenism. And I also had the privilege of serving as principal at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. I live in the Almaguin Highlands of Ontario's near north, on land ceded by the Ojibwe Nation in the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We're meeting today to hear from reports by readers of accounts of people who were in residential schools, many of them survivors of abuse. Each reader has something like 10 minutes total, and we need to have a little time for questions and comments before each successive speaker sits down. So I thought I might, if I had a bell, I'd ring it at 8-minute mark. I might cough. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. But I'll try to keep on time because we have 8 presenters. We are meeting on territory ceded by the Mississauga Nation in Crown Treaty Number 3, the Toronto Purchase of 1805. We are all treaty people, and we are friends of Egerton Ryerson. So let's begin with Susan Macaulay.
My book, and as they are all books, is A Knock on the Door. And A Knock on the Door is the essential history of residential schools from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, with a foreword by Phil Fontaine. Phil Fontaine was a survivor of his experience at residential schools. Phil Fontaine, the former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, was a survivor of the experience at Indian Residential School. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and its findings represent an historic moment for all survivors and Indigenous people everywhere. The Commission represents a monumental moment. The 5 years it took to put together this report represents thousands of survivors who experienced the misguided experiment of assimilation. It tells how fundamental systems of government fail to protect the social, economic, and cultural rights of the Indigenous. High quality education, health care, justice, child welfare were a passing dream. What is needed, said Phil, and I'm sure it's true, is for Canada to transform itself to embrace our true shared culture and history. I should also tell you this book was published in 2016, so some things said might seem out of date, but you'll recognize that it's a while ago. The residential school system was based on the assumption that European civilization and Christian religions were superior to Aboriginal culture, which was seen as savage and brutal. Indigenous children were discouraged from speaking their own languages. Aboriginal spiritual practices, such as the potlatch and the thirst dance, sun dance, were banned, as was Aboriginal marriage practice. In the 50s and 60s, the primary role of residential schools was cultural transformation of Aboriginal children. It was not to educate them, it was to bring them into our way of thinking and our language, of course. Now, I'm going to give you a little history here. In the 1880s, without authority, Canada through a pass system confined First Nations people to their reserves. Canada replaced existing forms of Aboriginal government, disempowered Aboriginal women who held power in many First Nations. Canada outlawed Aboriginal spiritual practices and jailed Aboriginal spiritual leaders. And Canada separated children from their parents, sending them to residential schools, not to educate them, but to break their link to their culture and identity. In 1920, the object was to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. These goals were restated in 1969. If every Aboriginal was absorbed into the body politic, there would be no reserves, no treaties, and no Aboriginal rights. At Canada's birth in 1867, Canadian churches operated boarding schools for the Aboriginal people. By 1930, there were 80 residential schools, moving on to 139, with at least 150,000 students. A government partnership with the churches lasted through 1969. Most schools closed by the 80s. The last Fed-supported residential school lasted until the late 1990s. The mandate of this report on the history, purpose, operation, and supervision. The mandate of the TRC was a report on the history, purpose, operation, and supervision of Canada's residential schools. A little history here. In the 15th century, the Roman Catholic Church, through the papacy, played a role in directing and legitimizing colonization prior to Christopher Columbus's voyage to America in 1490, by granting the Catholic kingdoms the right to colonize discovered lands. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI granted most of North America to Spain. In return, Spain were to convert the Indigenous people of North America to Christianity. Starting in the 16th century, the European states gained control of indigenous peoples' lands throughout the world, an era of mass migration. Over time, indigenous children from East Africa, Australia, and Siberia would be separated from parents and sent to residential schools. The outcome for Indigenous people was usually disastrous. Now, the school experience. Oh, good. Parents were anxious to have children write a legible letter at these schools. But not so. They were kept out of the classroom often so they could work to produce funds for the school. And that was important. In 1883, Principal Bawden said, "What we may expect from generality of children is certainly not to make great scholars of them. Good and moral as they may be, they lack great mental capacity. Some thought it risky to give them too much education."
You have 1 minute.
Okay. maybe I should stop. I think it's given you a little background. Many of the speakers will speak about residential schools more directly, and so I'll pass it on to them.
I was very interested, Sue, that the growth of the residential schools from the original, was it 60 or 80?
15th and 16th centuries, is that what you mean?
No, the number of residential schools.
Oh, from, what was it now?
Anyway, it was
huge.
significant.
It was significant. Yeah. I also thought it was interesting, where it all came from. It came from Europe and the Christian churches, the Catholic Church in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. I didn't know that. Anyway, I hope some of it was interesting.
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Gord McNulty.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. I have a bit of a book review here, so I'll start with that and just say that I'm covering residential schools by Larry Lowy. The author, Larry Lowy of Edmonton, grew up in a traditional Cree life. He was taken to a residential school at age 9, where he lived for 10 months of every year until he was almost 14. He worked at many jobs, from farmland to counselor, before he returned to school in his 50s to accomplish his lifelong dream of becoming a writer. He has a very careful and considerate writing style. This is a compact, well-written, and well-illustrated chronicle, providing insight into the story of the residential schools. It has many moving accounts of the dark side of residential schools, but it's balanced in the sense that some positive aspects of the schools are covered as well. The book is written in honor of all children who attended the schools. It features the words and images of those who survived. An important theme for me was one of the most disturbing aspects of the schools, how successive governments and the churches worked together to keep known abuses from public view. And certainly they were successful for generations. At high school from 1960 to 1965, I don't ever recall any mention of residential schools. I do also recall one rather sad moment. During public speaking, there was a shy, quiet student named Maria who chose to speak about Indians. And after she'd finished her presentation, the teacher made a few comments, but he finished with the remark, "Does anybody care about the Indians?" Quite a hurtful remark. And the entire class just sat there. I've always regretted the fact that we didn't go over to Maria and commend her for her interest in the Indians, as we call them now. The fate of the Indians were certain, Aboriginals was certainly a sad story. But ironically, the book mentions a royal proclamation by King George III of England in 1763. He recognized the right of, quote, several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected over the vast territory. So what theoretically should have worked out, unfortunately, did not work, as Aboriginals were viewed as being in the way of settlers and moved on to the reserves. The book covers the dark side of residential schools in straightforward fashion. Each child was given a number. Boys and girls were separated. Children suffered from inferior living conditions. I was struck by the extent to which the schools depended on cheap labor. Unless they were ill, all boys and girls did physical labor. Boys at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford had Thursday and Saturday afternoons off. On other days, they worked in the greenhouse, the chicken coop, and the barn. Students who complained that they weren't learning to read and write were ignored, blamed, or punished. What was certainly a low point came in 1920, when Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, said forcefully, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Scott had tremendous influence from 1913 to 1932 and dismissed all complaints and lawsuits against the school. Now, as early as 1922, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, the retired Chief Medical Officer for Indian Affairs, wrote about the appalling conditions in which Laurie describes in his brutally honest book, The Story of a National Crime. That book, I'm certainly interested in following up and seeing if it's available. Nothing, however, really changed over the years. In 1949, a Canadian Senate report questioned the residential school system and recommended that Aboriginal children attend mainstream schools. But it wasn't until 1969 that the legislation was passed to finally close the schools. And the assimilation concept still carried weight. As you can recall, Jean Chrétien's white paper that called for the end of Aboriginal treaty rights and status. I think most of us who weren't too familiar with the Aboriginal question at first glance thought that maybe Chrétien was onto the right track, not realizing, of course, the whole story. Chrétien's report did draw a strong backlash from Aboriginal leaders, and it was withdrawn. The author doesn't hesitate to point out the positive elements of the schools. Friendship and laughter helped many children survive, though they were often punished for having fun. Conditions improved somewhat in the 1950s when activities such as social clubs, movie nights, and outings were introduced. Boys and girls were allowed to talk to one another. The book has photos of children watching hockey on television, enjoying the excitement of Christmas, performing in amateur theater, and taking a sleigh ride. Levy points out that many dedicated, good people worked in the system, but as he notes, even hard-working and well-intentioned staff could not change the harshness of a system that all too often tolerated abuse and provided opportunities for it. One criticism of the book would be the author's negative approach toward Egerton Ryerson and Johnny MacDonald. Ryerson is briefly mentioned for a trip he made to England in 1836, where, according to Levy, he approved of a Baylor reform school for juvenile delinquents and recommended a similar system for Indian education. There is no mention of the tremendous friendship and admiration that existed between Ryerson and the Aboriginal community. And MacDonald, for his part, is criticized for his desire to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects, and the hanging of Louis Riel in 1885. Again, I know that there are a lot of supporters of Johnny MacDonald who would feel that a more balanced approach should be taken towards MacDonald. Levy ends on a hopeful note, taking pride in how Indigenous culture is growing much stronger, and we have a recognition that Aboriginal traditions enhance the mainstream. Quote, while we look back with sadness and pain, we look forward with hope and determination to the success of future generations. He also explores a number of myths about the schools, and 5 of them, as a matter of fact, are the outlines. So the book really is, as I said, would be ideal for the high schools today, I think, because it provides a really comprehensive summary, and the photographs are very, very impressive. It's ironic that the photos are nearly all quite positive. And of course, there wouldn't be any photos of the really difficult conditions, but you see the students posing for different events and enjoying themselves, and I just found that striking. So that's basically my report.
Okay. Gord, there's time for a couple of questions or comments. Rose?
Yeah. What year was that book published?
Just a few years ago, I think.
2 years ago.
Or maybe 4 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's assisted by co-authors, Wayne Spear and Constance Brissenden. Wayne Spear lives in Toronto, I believe. 2014.
Gord, I was thinking that on Ryerson's trip to Britain, where he was trying to work out relationships between the Canadian Methodist Church and the British Methodist Church, he also went to see the secretary, the foreign secretary, Glenelg. That's not quite right, Glenelg's post, but he was seeking land titles for Aboriginal people as well while he was there.
that's not mentioned here.
Yeah.
It's just a very, very brief mention of Ryerson.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's one shortfall, but the book, of course, doesn't go into any exploration of the various politicians to any extent. But 1920 was the year that this Duncan Campbell Scott made this very, not a very nice statement. 1920 was an interesting year in Canadian politics because Robert Borden resigned in July of 1920 to be succeeded by Arthur Meehan. And I'm quite interested to know if they were aware of what Scott was saying and how much power Scott had, and if either Borden or Meehan had any thoughts about it. It'd be interesting to look into their records. And I know they'd be busy at the time with the leadership transition, but nevertheless, I just, this Duncan Scott seemed to have a tremendous power, but he was only the deputy superintendent level. So how could this one man have such influence for so long?
Okay.
Thank you.
Your interest is going to take you to the archives of the Parliament of Canada. I can see it.
Thank you for that report. Hey, John Parker, please come forward.
Well, I didn't entirely understand correctly the nature of the assignment, so I'm not sure I'm on point with everything that I have to comment on today. And just to show you how comprehensive my failure to understand was, I read the same book that Gord read. But I also read another one, so I'll comment mostly on the other one. What I will say about the book that Gord has just summarized for you is that it was pretty clear to me, and I think it would be, and I think it leaps off the pages, that there were three different hands in producing this book, and it's easy to see which part was written by the playwright, and that's Larry Loyer, who's the prominent name on the cover. And what I got from that was he does sort of, to my mind, he does sort of a Ken Burns style presentation of the story he wants to tell. A whole lot of first-hand accounts by first-hand observers, accompanied by photographs. So the photographs lock you into the point that he's making, and then the words match the photographs, and together it's a very powerful way of presenting information. Short bits, but a lot of them, and the story they tell has been pretty much summarized by Gord. And I would pick up on Gord's point that it's not a diatribe. It tells the story, good, bad, and otherwise. It's mostly not a very pleasant story, and the impression is very clear that it was a system in the days chronicled here that was badly managed, badly funded, and inadequately supervised. And there's not a whole lot not a whole lot there for anyone to be terribly proud of. Whether it's a condemnation altogether of the entire policy and the entire approach, he doesn't get into that. But the other two authors do. I'm assuming that the other words are written by the other authors because they're entirely out of character with the account that dominates the bulk of the book. And that's where they get into the hard stuff. So let me just read you one bit from there. And Gord touched on this, but let me just quote you, because I read the whole thing. I read both books from through the lens, if I could use that overused term, of a friend of Egerton Ryerson. So my question was, what did Ryerson have to do with any of this, to the extent that we're unhappy with the practice in the residential schools? And there's one page in the book that mentions Ryerson. So this is that page. Just a couple of paragraphs. Indian boarding schools were recommended in a government report to the Legislative Assembly of Upper Canada in 1845. 2 years later, the Department of Indian Affairs wrote to Dr. Egerton Ryerson, the Methodist head of education in Upper Canada, asking for ideas for Indian schools. Ryerson had visited a reform school for juvenile delinquents on a trip to England in 1836. He approved of the brutal system and recommended a similar system for Indian education. Dr. Ryerson advised that, quotes, this presumably is an accurate quote. The education of Indians consists not merely of training the mind, but of weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, arts, and customs of civilized life. He cautioned the schools not to teach the children too much for fear that they would take jobs away from white people. That, to the extent that this book has anything to say about Ryerson, it's all in those two paragraphs. It's not attributed, it's not footnoted, it's not, no context is given for any of those remarks, and we're left with those words. And I'm sorry about that, because I'm not sure that that tells the story that deserves to be told. But to the extent that this book has anything to say about Ryerson, that's what it has to say, and it's not documented at all. Those words are in quotation marks, but without attribution. So Gord otherwise summarized what the book has. This one is where we get into the hard stuff. And I see somebody else has, I've got the book, and I'm wondering if somebody else is also presenting on this. This one gets into all of the indictments of practically everything that European influence has had in North America from the moment that Christopher Columbus set foot on the western shores. It's comprehensive, it's all-encompassing, it's exhaustive, and it pulls no punches whatsoever on anything that was done by any white person at any point since the arrival in North America. So it includes residential schools, but it's not a book about residential schools per se, although it's certainly included in there. And Duncan Campbell Scott is in the book, and he emerges as the Darth Vader of everything. He is the villain of the piece, and he was in charge of policy from 1922, well into the 30s. I couldn't see anything in anything that he did that at all draws from the experience or lessons or conduct of Egerton Ryerson. To the extent that he had anything to do with anything, it is a complete and utter departure from everything I know about Ryerson. Now, how much of my 10 minutes have I already used up?
6.
Okay, so there's enough time for me to give you my favorite passage from the book. This is the juiciest part of the book, and it's the most delightful quotation that I came across, and I'll quote it to you verbatim. To come to the point at once, I beg to say that I have not the least belief in the noble savage. I consider him a prodigious nuisance and an enormous superstition. His calling rum firewater and me a paleface wholly fail to reconcile me to him. I don't care what he calls me, I call him a savage, and I call a savage a something highly desirable to be civilized off the face of the earth. He is a savage, cruel, false, thievish, murderous, addicted more or less to grease, entrails, and beastly customs, a wild animal with the questionable gift of boasting, a conceited, tiresome, bloodthirsty, monotonous humbug. It gets better. Yet it is extraordinary to observe how some people will talk about him as they talk about the good old times. There was Mr. Catlin. He was an artist who went into the native communities and produced a large number of paintings depicting their circumstances. There was Mr. Catlin. Some years ago with his Ojibwe Indians, Mr. Catlin was an energetic, earnest man who had lived among more tribes of Indians than I need reckon up here, and who had written a picturesque and glowing book about them. With his party of Indians squatting and spitting on the table before him, or dancing their miserable jigs after their own dreary manner, he called in all good faith upon his civilized audience to take notice of their symmetry and grace, their perfect limbs, and the exquisite expression of their pantomime, and their civilized audience in all good faith complied and admired. Whereas As mere animals, they were wretched creatures, very low in the scale and very poorly formed. It is not the miserable nature of the noble savage that is the new thing. It is the whimpering over him with maudlin admiration and the affecting to regret him and the drawing of any comparison of advantage between the blemishes of civilization and the tenor of his swinish life. To conclude as I began, my position is that if we have anything to learn from the noble savage, it is what to avoid. His virtues are a fable, his happiness is a delusion, his nobility nonsense. The world will be all the better when his place knows him no more. That was written in 1853. The author was Charles Dickens. A little glimpse at the mentality that existed in those days. And as a friend of Egerton Ryerson, think of I'm going to make my pitch here now. Think of the work that Ryerson did, how he did it, how he went about it, and the respect he showed to the people he was working with, and what he was up against in the attitudes of educated, refined, influential people around him. Maybe that's my 10 minutes.
Well, I think there's time for questions or comments. Thank you, John. Lynn?
Oh, yes. Very interesting. The dreadful remarks attributed to Ryerson, I'm very sure he never said, certainly not in Story of My Life or Life and Letters or any of those things. Is the author still alive? And could you send him an email and say, we'd like to know what your source is, because it seems very unlikely that he ever said anything of the kind.
You're talking about this one. Well, as Gord said, this was published in 2014, so just not much more than 10 years ago. So presumably someone can follow up on that question.
Yeah.
Pretty juicy quote, not attributed. That is not a mistake made in this book. And let me make that clear. This one is researched and footnoted throughout. Now, I didn't make a research project to see just how authentic and authoritative the source material was, but this book, nothing is printed here that isn't backed up by something that's produced somewhere else. I don't have the same confidence about all of the comments made here.
Well done. Thank you.
Who's the author of Stolen Lives?
Interesting question. Who's the author of Stolen Lives? They don't admit to having an author.
Oh.
It is produced by an organization, so no
right.
individual name is on it. There's a word on the introduction, but no one takes credit for being the author of any particular portion. It's obviously the work of a lot of people.
The book that I have is Broken Circle, and it's by Fontaine. And one of the things I think, and I'm going to be brief because there's a lot of history that's already been mentioned, is that when everything changed, he was 7 years old. He was a little boy, and he was loved by his parents and his cousins and family. And through no fault of the parents, it was legislated that he go to residential school, and that's when his life became very difficult. So here, the contrast, and I think that's the most poignant part of it, is that he knew nothing but love and family, and then he was put into the residential schools, and it was very hard for him. And, so that's really my point, is that it still sits with me as I read it, that a 7-year-old, who knows nothing but love and family, and all of a sudden is put into a different situation. And I can only feel for him. And this book is the dark legacy of the Indian residential school. So there's a lot of family in here, and a lot of things that come out. Blueberry picking. He used to blueberry pick with his family. So it's quite a good book, and I appreciated it.
Could you give us some examples of Phil's experience in residential school?
I'll pluck it. Let me see. Here's a start of it. Walking with mom and dad on that life-changing day in September, and it's 1948. I remember no confusion, no sadness, no desperation, only joy and innocence on a trek that seems now to have taken longer than it actually did. And I walked this road many times with Dad and Grandpa on our way to hunt and check snares and traps. The old Hudson's Bay Company store, established on the shores of Winnipeg, remember that, river, was about a mile west of our home. In 1948, there were no other houses between our place and the store. There were only 4 houses, so it was really country. So that's a little bit of it. And so I'll say, so Mom would say in the Ojibwe, when you go to school, you will be able to read comics because they familiarized him with things, and then he could read comics. Sort of things. In my mind, this would be the greatest benefit of my schooling, and so he's poking at it, and Mom and even Dad use this to fuel my desire whenever the subject of school came up. I thought that was kind of interesting. Mom had high hopes that I would go to be successful in something away from the reserve. Her goal for us to be just good as white kids. And I find that difficult, when somebody says differentiates and talks white kids. But that's how the phrasing is. Her goal was for us to be just as good as white and do what they can do. Mom was God-fearing Christian and was easily and deeply influenced by the church, particularly by the sermons of the priest.
Keep that.
Oh, sorry. And as I'm reading parts of this book, I'm disliking more and more the nuns and the priests. That's historical, and it's described the way it is, and you have to sort of reflect on it. Oh, sorry. There.
So Carolyn, what things happened? What did nuns and priests do that distressed Phil?
Well, what they did was they demeaned him, and they made him feel less than a person. And my previous encounters with priests and nuns had been non-threatening, so he acknowledges that. As I had some control over them, I can remember watching my sister leave the church after Sunday Mass when she was still in school, and he was 4 or 5. The priest and sometimes the nun also came out and mingled, only after everyone had left the church. So that's what they did. After they had left the church, they came and they talked to him. But I think that they made him feel less than. Made him feel less than a real person, and I think that that's unfortunate.
Okay, thank you. Rose, your turn.
Okay, well, thank you. I have 3 books, but I'm going to try to be brief with all of them. I'm going to be talking about Thompson Highway, who had quite a different take on residential schools. He makes reference to the administrators, the nuns and the priests, as on the whole being very kind and helpful to us. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first book I'm going to talk about is entitled A Tale of Monstrous Extravagance. It came out in 2015, published by the University of Calgary Press, and is based on a memorial lecture that was given there. A couple of quotes from the books. There are a number of them throughout. One is, speaking one language, I submit, is like living in a house with one window. Another one is, Allure, multiculturalism is the greatest gift you can give your child. He talks about the languages and communities that have shaped him: Cree, Dene, Latin, English, French, Spanish, and the universal language of music. Born on a snowbank he always talks about that in his books, the fact that he was born on a snowbank on the joint border of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. Like his two older siblings, he was flown to and from the Pas, Manitoba, to what he calls boarding school in a bush plane, and his experience at residential schools took place in the 50s. So I'll just read a little passage on his experience. Okay, so he says, at age almost 7, I left the paradise that is northern Manitoba to go to boarding school. That's what I call it because for me it was a positive experience. Because of the practically Jewish Jesuit style regimented education that I got at that school. For one thing, I enjoy today a thriving international career that takes me regular as clockwork to all 6 inhabited continents. I just got back from India and I'm on my way to Brazil. I say I left paradise, but the truth is it was only for 10 months of every year, the 2 months of summer. They were so spectacular that they more than replaced the other 10 months, especially with parents as remarkable as ours. As a boy of 11 fishing commercially with his dad from 3 in the morning until 6 in the evening, just the two of us in a canoe, was and 2 elder brothers manning another, brother-in-laws and whatnot, manning a third, and a Sunday as our only day off. I got to spend more time with this fantastic man, Joe Highway, in just one summer than the richest white boy in Rosedale gets to spend with his in a lifetime. But back to the school, it was, of course, a Catholic school, and being a boy, age 6 going on 7, I was pressed into service as an altar boy. This is was the late 1950s, going into the early 1960s. That we speak of before the Second Vatican Council of 1962 transpired, wherein the Pope changed the liturgy from one said in Latin to one said in the vernacular of whatever country. I was born already when that council happened. I was 10 already when that council happened, so that I had already gotten, to my immense pleasure, to learn all that gorgeous Latin, all that gorgeous Gregorian chanting. I still know it. Then he goes on to say, and then after Latin, I finally encountered English full force. Again, I had a gas. I even, much later on once, I was out of the sheltered atmosphere of boarding school and what amounted to 200 siblings, that is my classmates, schoolmates, whom I loved and still do with all my heart. Once I left the supportive atmosphere of my own family and ended up at a high school in Winnipeg, it turned out to be an exercise in rank and dreadful embarrassment. All our humiliation, as it turns out, the English that we had learned among ourselves at that boarding school was a pidgin English that belonged only and exclusively to that isolated place way out in the bush, some 30 kilometers north of the railway town of the Pas, Manitoba. Then he says, he talks about his hurt over all this, but still, I swallowed my pride, my hurt, my pride, my sorrow, wiped off my tears and soldiered on. And with the help of many remarkable, kind, and very generous white people, right up to my years in university and beyond, I eventually mastered it until I could speak it as well as Queen Elizabeth. Fortunately, I had the privilege of learning yet another language at the same time as I did English, and this language was music. I had picked up the piano at the boarding school where they had arranged for him to have piano lessons. And once I was in high school in Winnipeg, Indian Affairs, God bless them, always made sure they boarded me at a home that had a piano for which I was obsessed with, as I was obsessed with the instrument. My paternal grandfather was a legendary fiddler. My mother played the accordion, and so I, third generation of this line of musicians, would become a pianist. It was a natural progression. So that's what he has to say about residential schools, and he reinforces that impression and the others. The next book, so his experience continues in the next book, which is about the Guy Hill Residential School. He talks about leaving his parents filled with excitement. The particular residence he attended, residential school he attended, was new to replace one that had just burnt down. He was among the first group of students that arrived there, all 300 of them. And he talks about having been filled with awe and anxiety, experiencing new tastes, new touches, and new smells, especially plastic, which he was not used to. Expectations of him, how everything was free. He couldn't get over this. Free clothes, free food, free accommodation, school supplies. It was an observation that he made frequently throughout his experiences as it relates to the Christmas concerts and the costumes provided, gifts for everyone. All 300 students get something or other, sports equipment, and more. He explains the student numbering practice as essential to enable efficient administration regarding clothes, private lockers, and so on. He says identifying everyone by name would have been impossible, both for students and staff. When he first arrives, he marvels at his new creature comforts that he's experiencing for the first time: running water, electricity, crisp white sheets, and his own bed, his very own bed, which was a treat to him. His worst moments at this school were getting teased and bullied by fellow students for being girlish, given that he had has a two-spirited nature. Having to participate in team sports was another thing he didn't like, because he was not good at all the things that were introduced: hockey, volleyball, and so on, and field day in the spring. Unlike his older brother Daniel, whom he claims excelled at hockey. The best moments at the school were studying music, and especially when he was provided with the opportunity to take lessons and learn to play the piano. He even, because I guess the staff had entered him into this contest, he won first prize one year, having participated in the local Kiwanis music festival. And he made the local papers in that instance with the headline, "Brochette Lad Wins Piano Trophy." Brochette was a town in just over the border into the Northwest Territories, from which he came and where his parents lived and where he was flown to when he went home for his summer holidays. Was he ever sexually molested? Yes. By a brother, Felix Lamone, who crept into the middle boys' dorm in the night and had the habit of fondling everyone's genitals. Later, when he enters the rank, I could read your section on that if I have time, but suffice to say that he found it distressing, although not overly, because he felt he wasn't really of an age where it meant much to him, and he just assumed that was a rite of passage for the way white men treated their younger boys. He later on, when he enters the rank of the big boys, because the children in these schools were separated into three categories. There was the little boys, the middle boys, and the big boys, and it was the same for the girls. When he enters the rank of the big boys, he makes the observation at one of the dance classes where the waltz and the polka are being taught to these big boys and girls, how eagerly everyone anticipated the event as a chance to squeeze their favorite partners, and that Brother Lamone's predatory tendencies didn't seem to cool any of the big boys' ardor. He also relates an incident where one night the boys in their PJs crept into the girls' dorm just as they find their sought-after partners. A nun appears and turns on the lights and chases them all back to their own quarters. So that's and so he says quite a bit about this experience, but which on the whole is very positive for him. He the book concludes when he leaves the residential school for the last time to go to Winnipeg for grade 11. And the final, this particular book, Permanent Astonishment, was written or published in 2021. And then the last book is based on a CBC Massey Lectures, is titled Laughing with the Trickster on Sex, Death, and Accordions. And that came out in 2022. What's written about it? It says here that it's a brilliant book, of course. One of the world's most treasured Indigenous creators provides spectacular insights into the glory and anguish of life. He brings his signature irreverence to the exploration of 5 themes to the human condition: language, creation, sex, gender, humor, and death. An invigorating comparison of Christian, classical, and Cree mythologies reveal their contributions to Western thought, life, and culture, and how North American Indigenous mythologies provide unique, timeless solutions to our modern problems, and so on. So that's his book. I found this the last one very interesting in terms of his comparison between classical thought and indigenous belief systems, and then Christianity in the Middle East. Quite critical of Christianity or monotheism in terms of how patriarchal it is, and the extent to which the indigenous were converted by the Catholics in particular, which forbade or forbid divorces. And he observed, I guess, in some of the indigenous communities that had been converted, an incidence of female abuse that bothered him a great deal. He had a sister that married or was caught up in an abusive marriage, which may have been one of the inspirations for this observation. Anyway, that's it.
Who is the author, Rose?
Thompson Highway.
Oh, this is another Thompson Highway.
They're all 3 of them are Thompson Highway.
Wow. You've given him excellent voice. Wow.
Well, he
questions
he
or comments
that
you want to address to Rose?
It's brilliantly written, wouldn't you say, Rose?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes. There's also a lot of discussion on the difference between the languages. Like Cree is as different from Dene, apparently, as English would be from Arabic. And he also gets into the difficulties of learning English, or because of the obsession with gender. I guess they don't have that in the indigenous languages. Perhaps not so much with English, but certainly with French or Spanish, everything has a male and female gender. So I thought that was interesting. Oh, also in this Permanent Astonishment, some of the things that they can teach us about how to live in survival circumstances. One thing that sticks out for me is a transistor radio that one of his sisters managed to get up there in the Northwest Territories to listen to country western music on their summer holidays. And when they'd have a battery in there, eventually it would run out. And of course, you couldn't run out and get new batteries or recharge them. So what they did was boiled the battery in hot water for half an hour, and that recharged it.
Wow. Wow.
Can I ask,
John?
Rose, thanks for your commentary. What I get from your words is that Thompson Highway lived through a lot of unpleasant experiences, and he tells those stories. But the voice that comes across is sort of one of lament and regret, but not anger. I don't get the sense that he has a chip on his shoulder at all.
No,
Is that the sense you got from the books?
yes. I don't know that there was so much regret. He celebrates his experience as something that broadened his horizon. He sees learning only one language as tantamount to living in a house with only one window.
But I mean, to the extent that he speaks of abuse and mistreatment and so on, I don't hear anger coming across. And I'm just wondering if that's your voice or his voice that were.
Well, I didn't get much in the way of his references to abuse. apart from that one paragraph, which I don't think I have time to read, but it's in there.
Oh, you were very descriptive. We don't need anything more.
I didn't think so.
Great.
Bruce Weber.
I wanted to report on Thompson Highway. He was so much fun to read, except that his early recollections of growing up in the far north, being born on a snowbank, brought to me the wonderment of how we would ever create schools that would fit those day schools that would fit those situations. Anyhow, my name is Bruce Weber, which identifies me as coming from Kitchener. I graduated from Waterloo and Western in 1964 in economics. Oh, I did have the opportunity I had at least 4 basically interventions with Indigenous affairs. First was the 2 years that I worked for Indian Affairs, including Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. Secondly was, and my experience with the Huastecan people of the mountains of Mexico. Third, I had the opportunity to, while I was nursing at the orthopedic hospital, I had the opportunity to fly in as a volunteer for freeze up, that is the 2 months when the ice is freezing in the far north. And I had the opportunity to fly in as a volunteer nurse to a place called Summer Beaver, which was a wonderful experience, except thank heavens I only had 2 real emergencies, and our only connection was radio connection to Lansdowne House, and from there they had to relay the message to Sioux Lookout. Anyhow, it was a fabulous experience. Instead of doing Thompson Highway, I was aware of a blog a year ago on surviving St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. And that, in fact, is where I lived for 3 months in '64. And I must say, it was a neat experience. I wrote an email just months ago saying, but when I lived at St. Michael's Residential School, Duck Lake, Saskatchewan for 3 months in 1964, since I was attached to the Duck Lake Indian Agency and there was no other spare room in the village, I was pressed into square dancing with the kids every Thursday night. It certainly seemed like a very reasonable place. Getting into this blog on surviving St. Michael's, a fascinating blog, and it's written by, this is the introduction. Last May, investigative journalist Connie Walker came upon a story about her late father she'd never heard before. One night back in the late 1970s, when he was working as an officer in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he pulled over a suspected drunk driver. He walked up to the vehicle and came face to face with a ghost from his past, a residential school priest. What happened on the road that night set into motion an investigation that would send Connie deep into her own past, trying to uncover the secrets of her family and the legacy of trauma passed down through the generations. And yes, I had lived there. Father Duhame had invited me to rent the spare room at the school. I traveled with Father Gauthier on the weekends in his camper, who said Mass in some of the remote reserves. And this blog that I listened to last Wednesday night that went I listened to it from 11 o'clock at night till 4 in the morning, and was absolutely mind-blowing. It was all about that school. It was about Father Duhane and Father Gauthier. Father Duhane died. Father Gauthier, in the last 2 years, was still alive, living in a nursing home outside of Edmonton, and they interviewed him at the end of this great blog, or near the end of this great blog, when he denied he had personally been involved in any sexual abuse, in spite of the fact that he was the one who was beaten up by Connie's father that night at the side of the road. He was also grabbed at another conference that had come together of school survivors, and at one point was held over the balcony when he was persuaded not to be harmed. Anyhow, it was a very mind-blowing experience, and the fact that I had been there was,
Wow.
yes. Thank you.
Any comments or questions for Bruce?
Bruce, I want to spend an evening with you and hear more about that career of yours every step along the way.
I enjoyed every job I ever had in my life, except working at my dad's factory in Kitchener.
Okay.
Yes, Rose?
Yeah. So was it these charges against the two priests, were they ever proven? Or?
Yes, to the point, they certainly, Connie, she had been separated from her father since age 6, who remarried another family. But she interviewed all her family and then found out that not only her father, at least her 2 or 3 of her brothers had been sexually abused by Father Gauthier in particular. And yeah, he goes into that. The blog goes into some.
Okay, so this was in the blog. It wasn't sort of proven in court or whatever.
No,
Mm.
and the author went to. Of course, they cannot get into the records of the Truth and to the Truth Commission, but they did get beyond there, where they could at least find the names of people who had made interventions, and they came out with specific reports of abuse.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. Very telling story.
Thank you.
Anne.
I am going to go back to Thompson Highway, to a book that wasn't recommended for presenting by our leader. However, I did think that it was very worthwhile. I'm part of a book club at Rosedale Church, and we were doing Kiss of the Fur Queen, and I thought you might be interested in how a book club responds to such a novel.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm going to refer to the residential school experience, both in Kiss of the Fur Queen and Permanent Astonishment, a memoir. The first being out in 1998, and as Rose mentions regarding Permanent Astonishment, 2021. So there is a big difference, and the style is very different. One is very poetic, metaphorical, and the other is an autobiography. Now, the content, of course, of Kiss of the Fur Queen focuses on Gabriel and Jeremiah and their time at the school. And the people in the book club wanted to know why Thompson Highway was speaking so positively about residential schools. And he does acknowledge that there is abuse, and yet there are very positive experiences too, such as learning to play the piano and dancing lessons, which Rose has already mentioned. But Highway says he benefited because of the lessons, etc. Whether the Indigenous students benefited depended on the school and the experiences that he or she had, such as sports, music, etc. So it was a matter of what you focused on, seemed to be what the people found in Kiss of the Fur Queen as making the difference as to what how you felt about the school after the fact. And they also felt that the family's attitude really mattered. Highway's father said, for instance, look for the silver lining. And this comment comes up again and again. In other words, it's what you made of it as opposed to how you became victimized. And part of being victimized, of course, was your own fault. That's what they implied. Also, the love and support by Highway's family was important. This made it quite different than the average. And his father encouraged the boys to go. And so they had his support throughout. Now, that was how the ladies in this book club reconciled the stories of abuse and mismanagement on one hand, and how someone like Thompson Highway could speak on broader topics, and his joy with regard to playing the piano, dancing lessons, etc. Now, something else they got interested in was the treatment of Aboriginal women, and how young people came from the north and that they had very little support. So a lot of it seems to be where you come, where the Indigenous children were coming from, and how they dealt with it when they were there. And also, and that was true of the abuse of women, especially outside of the school. Music and dance became an escape for a number of them. Now, the situation of the residential schools has been documented at several museums in Winnipeg. The Manitoba Museum, the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, the Indigenous Shoreline Museum, and the Urban Sharman. I have been to the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and it is really very fascinating. And it's a great portrayal, so if you're ever in that area, look into that. But coming back to why Jeremiah and Gabriel, and I use those words, names, because they are the names that were given to the boys when they came to the school. Part of their success that the women kept stressing is that these boys were from a high-achieving family. The parents find a silver lining. Parents volunteered to send their sons to school. And they also got, it may appear to be a bit of digression, but the women in the group brought up the subject of a novel by Claire Keegan, Some Small Things Like These, which was published in 2021, wherein the disturbing secrets at a convent in 1985 in Ireland were made public. The stories, the real life stories of Magdalene laundries run by Catholic Church women were found out. And an example, of course, these women were in need of help because they were unwed mothers, etc. And they were forced into unpaid labor. And it started in the 18th century and ended up in the late 20th century. And it was, the women in the book club felt there were strong parallels here between the abuse of the Catholic Church in one situation and that of another. And that particular book, there's a film. Cillian Murphy stars in it. Fallen Women. So there we have the take of the book club on The Kiss of the Fur Queen. Rose.
Well, you mentioned the labor that was expected of the residents at the school in Ireland. And
Yes.
I know other leaders have made reference to the fact that many of these residential school attendees were exploited. That certainly is not the case in Permanent Astonishment. I mean, they
No.
seem to get regular time off. These kids weren't expected to, well, there were certain things they had to help with, especially when the flu hit, for example, on one occasion, and most of the staff and students were smitten with high temperatures and whatnot. Then kids would be pressed into service. But for the most part, there was no exploitive labor expected of them.
Apparently, in the story relating to Ireland, these women were forced to work in the laundries. They got no pay. Their children were often sold to immigrants or people passing through.
Sold? Did you say sold?
Sold, S-O-L-D. It's a really short novel, 118 pages. It's worth reading. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
It really is. But it just shows another example of exploitation. So certainly Indigenous children were exploited, but it was something that was going on in other areas as well. Certainly the Magdalen laundries from the 18th century to the end of the 20th century. It's a similar time frame.
But not always.
Not always. Well, read the book.
Well, I have read the book. I've read Permanent Astonishment, and there was no evidence.
I know, but
labor.
my reference, Rose, was to the Claire Keegan book. Look for the small things. There were a number of course, Indigenous children that were adopted. Never went the route of the schools. Jean Chrétien's family adopted an Indigenous child. My stepfather from Winnipeg, originally from Prince Albert, adopted an Indigenous child. And these people, these kids, they had no access to their culture. Their lifestyle was more like Gabriel and Jeremiah's. So there were many ways that Indigenous children were integrated into North American society. And that continues, eh?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.
Before I start, I just very quickly say something about what Gord was asking. Duncan Campbell Scott, how he got away with it. He's famous for really making the schools unpleasant. He got away with it because politicians didn't care. They paid no attention to Indigenous issues. And in fact, 1920, when he took over, that's when it became a requirement that Indigenous people go to school. Up to that time, it had been voluntary. The government, from time to time, put pressure on, but in 1920, it became obligatory. However, what people don't realize is you had to attend a school. It could either be a residential school or a community school. And I'm going to give you both here. So, Maria Campbell, no relation, was born in 1940. And the description, this is very well written. It's very matter of fact. She had a very unpleasant early life, but she just describes it as if it happened. So her people were entitled to land, but they couldn't get it. So they lived on a road allowance, that is, a piece of land that was set aside for a road that hadn't been used. They became known as the road allowance people. The life they had, as they said, it's gone. Even though it's only 1940, the way they lived had disappeared. She describes her life, which involved rape by an RCMP officer. It involved prostitution. It involved living with a number of men. It's really, she does it all matter-of-factly. Otherwise, you'd be absolutely horrified. She came out of this very well. She's now a counselor for her people. She is a respected elder. There's an afterwards in here that talks about that. So her experience with schools, she only went to a residential school for a short time because they opened the community school some 3 miles away. So here's what she wrote about the residential school. I can recall little from that part of my life besides feeling lonely and frightened when I was left with the sister at the school. The place smelled unpleasantly of soap and old women. I could hear my footsteps echoing through the building. We prayed endlessly, but I cannot recall ever doing much reading or schoolwork, as Mama had said I would. Just prayers and my job, which was cleaning the dorms and hallways. I do recall most vividly a punishment I once received. We weren't allowed to speak Cree, only French and English. And for disobeying this, I was pushed into a small closet with no windows or light and locked in for what seemed like hours. I was almost paralyzed with fright. She's a little girl at this point. When they came to let me out, I remember the last day of school and the sense of freedom I felt when Dad came for me. He promised I would never go back, as the school had been built at home. So the school, built some 3 miles away, was attended by Métis and by whites. They didn't get along. The Métis sat on one side, the whites sat on the other. The whites brought things like sandwiches and cakes. The Métis had bannock with lard on it and maybe some meat. If they didn't have that, they ate gophers. And the whites, of course, were horrified, the white kids. By the way, the Métis did not get along generally with Indians. They did not generally get along with whites who looked down on them. She mentions a few whites in her life who were sympathetic to Métis, but generally the three groups didn't mix. This is the new school, the community school. School wasn't too bad, heaven compared to that residential school. We had a lot of fights with the white kids, but finally, after beating them soundly, we were left alone. Our first teacher was a sad-looking little English woman in her late 40s. She had never taught half-breeds before, and we soon realized she didn't like us. I remember her long, straight skirts, her black woven stockings, and ugly black shoes. She had very little hair, and what little she had, she sprayed back into a bun. She loved to sing, and her favorite song was "O Canada." I can still see her whenever I hear that song, waving her arms up and down, completely off key and getting all red in the face from the effort. We had many different teachers during these years. Some got the girls pregnant and had to leave. Others were alcoholic. And because our school attracted everybody else's rejects, we had a constant stream of teachers. We had one good teacher, Mrs. Park, who was stern but fair, Maybe it was because she treated us as equals that I liked her and did well in school. So even in the community school, there was abuse.
Yes, thank you. We've heard a lot, and it's been great. What I wanted to do is bring it back to Ryerson and to show how very different what he advocated for schools was from what actually happened. So there is a PowerPoint. I'll go through it really very quickly, but just to make a few points. And I think it was interesting that the residential schools, there were differences among them. And Thompson Highway's experience was largely favorable, but also they were well fed. You know, they were quite different. There was a great variation in them. Anyways, so let's just go through this very quickly. A knock on the door is a very excellent. A knock on the door is a terrific source. Chapter 2 on school experiences has 483 notes with definite sources. So it's really very, very solid there. Next slide, please. And here is a list of the memoirs that were available. A couple people found other ones. And then the next one, please. You can see the first one goes back to, I think, is it 1960? And then Maria Campbell's was the second one. And they're now coming out more frequently, and I dare say there'll be more out in the coming years. And you can see from their titles, they are mainly sad experiences. But there is some variation, certainly like Thompson and Highways is very different. Okay, next one, please. And so what I wanted to go over is that if you look at the material in A Knock on the Door, which is the most detailed compilation of what went wrong, I say there are 8 deadly sins of residential schools. Not everyone, everywhere, not all of the time, but 8 of them. And a lot of them talked about being de-Indianized or un-Indianized with beatings for using their native language. Well, of course, nothing like that with Ryerson, as we shall see. And the children were not encouraged. Gratuitous brutality. Children forced to eat their vomit. This is reported. I mean, you know, this isn't made up. Children actually describe those things. And for speaking their own languages. And then the expectations of pupils, they lack mental capacity. This was said. Next slide, please. And so that you couldn't expect much of them. However, a missionary who was teaching children describes how excellent they were. And this is from Ryerson material. That they were excellent. The children were perfectly tractable. They are eager at all times to obtain knowledge, and they have more retentive memories from other children. Other children are the white kids, obviously, in this context. And this was reported in the Christian Guardian, and you'll see a number of reports. This is the Christian Guardian, which Ryerson was the founding editor. It reports lots on Indigenous people, including problems that they faced. And so that his ambition for children, for Indigenous children, the one school that he did gave some advice on, was to have a school where they would learn farming. He never had a system for schools in general, but just for those who wanted to learn farming for the last, say, 4 to 8 years of their schooling, so that they would be at home and living at home and going to a day school, but then this school that he recommended as an industrial school, I think they probably weren't built, apart from the ones that the Methodists had quite early. And then they didn't work out because they didn't have enough funding. Anyways, next slide, please. That separation from the families, this was very traumatic for the parents of the children as well. And this gets described in A Knock on the Door, just of how difficult it was for them when their children were taken away. The Methodist schools, of course, were voluntary, and for most of the time, the children would be at home. The half-day system of instruction, a number of people mentioned how the kids had to work. Well, they had to work at their school in order to save on staff costs, because Indian Affairs was really stingy.
And this is thoroughly documented in A Knock on the Door. Well, Ryerson expected if in this farming place that he advocated, it would have been expensive. He doesn't see any ways of cutting them off. And the kids would work hard on the farm, but they would be paid for their work, and it would be farm work. And they're trying to learn to be farmers, you know. So it's not like they are basically making up for inadequate funding. Now, the Thompson Highway example is quite different. I think the school where he was, it was adequately funded. The food was good. There's no mention of having to do the work. It seems that it's at the high end of the schools. And in the ones that the Methodists started, they used the pestalozzi method of instruction, which is apparently something like Montessori. And they had more equipment, and they were quite good schools. Hope McLean's discussion of them in her work, which has been published, and she says they were very good schools, that they were probably better than what European kids were getting at the time in Upper Canada. Next one, please. That lower pay for teachers. This was absolutely routine in the Indian Affairs schools. And it was explained in A Knock on the Door that some teachers were dedicated and they stayed on, but some would go and get a job in a regular school as soon as they could because they were badly paid. I mean, this is just dreadful. Now, Ryerson was always wanting to make sure that teachers were well paid and that they were regularly paid in the school boards. But this was Indian Affairs policy. Then lower pay for teachers was routine, and then, we'll move on to the next one. And the food allowance was lower than for other boarding schools. They made a comparison with a boarding school for the deaf, and there was a better food allowance for the deaf than it was for Indian children. And when the Canada food rules came out, I think it was in 1942, it was clear that the food that was given at the residential schools was not up to a basic standard, and so they had to increase it. But as I say, there's A Knock on the Door. They just really, really go to town on what went wrong. And there are many, many complaints that the kids were hungry. The food was too mushy. Now, at Thompson Highway School, the food was good, you know, and they did, I don't know that they had much venison or things like that, but they had roast pork and vegetables and ice cream with chocolate sauce for dessert, you know, he gives these descriptions that they had meat, and children in many of the schools did not get meat. It was mushy, cheap food. Next slide, please. And so then the last one was lack of sports facilities. Some schools did have them, but some didn't. And there are examples written in A Knock on the Door where the principal tried to get money to build a gymnasium because sports were good for them. And children who were demeaned in the classroom found that they could excel at sports. And so, but if the school didn't have a gymnasium, tough luck, just, you know, it just didn't work. So next slide, please. So the Methodist leaders did have these high expectations for children. Just when you make these comparisons, it's just so very different. Next slide, please. I'm going to wind up pretty soon because we don't have much. We spent quite a bit of time. Now, this is the Christian Guardian, which Ryerson was the editor when it started in 1829. And here, can you read it? Is it clear enough to read? You see, and so here you have Ryerson in a very early issue. He's getting Indigenous input into the Christian Guardian, so that, and people who are taking the Christian Guardian will then learn something about the Indigenous people that the school and mission, that they read and write and so on. This was published in the Christian Guardian, and let me just, I think I've got one more slide. Oh, Joseph Sawyer. He was an Indigenous man, an Indigenous leader, and was an early person to be Christianized. And so here you see that he writes something in his own language, and it gets published in the Christian Guardian. I guess Ryerson just wanted to show, we're open, we work together on things. None of this stuff about you can't speak your own language. They had hymns translated into Chippewa so that they could be sung, and he reports that the Indigenous people liked to hear about God in their own language. That there was a crossover. So then next slide. This is the well, it's not laid out that way, but this is the, as you can see, the title, The Masthead of the Christian Guardian. And here it is. This is from David Sawyer. And here it is. If you can't read it, I can't read it either. But it's Egerton Ryerson is getting a translation so people will see these are the people that we are serving. So I thought that was interesting to see that. It's a very early issue, number 12, that they did put this in, and you see a lot of going back and forth in references to God as the Great Spirit. Again, crossover in presentation. So this is just trying to bring it back to what Ryerson advocated and his own experience of Indigenous people at the credit, which is totally different from the kinds of things that happen in residential schools. It's just so to see any reference that he recommended such horrible things was really quite startling. So, anyways, back to you, Peter, or I think, or does anyone have any questions? I don't know. Are we going to be thrown out of the room yet?